Today, let's take a look at success. Because this, in the end, is what every one of us is looking for. What is success? What makes for success? Researchers have been investigating the performances of sports persons, particularly because the results show immediately, and have been struggling to find out, to put their finger on what is it that makes for peak performance. You yourselves have seen in the recent past Indian cricket team performing dismally until recently, and suddenly it's as if they were a transformed lot, as if it's a different team altogether. What is it that makes the difference? Is it talent? No, it's the same people, the same talent, the same training, the same hang-ups. Then what makes the difference? We need to understand this not from the viewpoint of the sports persons, but from our own viewpoint. Because each one of us comes up with spectacular performance, but only sometimes. And at other times, we're mediocre. Sometimes we are dismal failures. But that's not enough. Today, the world is demanding excellence from us, not once in a while, not occasionally, but every single time. The question that arises in our minds is it possible, first of all? Is the human system capable of perfection at all? Or are we doomed to imperfections? When you look at our system, the internal system, you find we have been designed physically, physiologically. We've been designed to perfection. Every single cell in our body, every single aspect of our personality is absolutely perfect. And in this perfect system, you and I seem to muck things up so badly. What is the root cause of all this disturbance? What is the cause of all this suffering? Eventually, we are the ones who suffer. So, what is success? Is the question. Martin Luther King said, if a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep streets even as Michelangelo painted, or Beethoven played music, or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will pause to say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. This is what success is all about. It's not about one person coming up with outstanding performance. It's about every single individual, right from a Nobel Prize winner to a street sweeper. If each one of us works like the way Martin Luther King says, what a wonderful society we'd come up with. But no, yes, we come up with excellent performances, but they are islands of excellence in a sea of mediocrity. So the challenge before us is to identify what makes for success. And so, as we said earlier, people who investigated sports persons particularly, whether it's a Tiger Woods or a Sania Mirza or a Sachin Tendulkar or whoever it is, and they found that success comes from essentially a calm mind in which the intellect is focused, sharp, clear, incisive. And this combination of a calm mind and a focused intellect leads to perfect action. This is not the discovery of modern investigators. This is what the Bhagavad Gita said 5,000 years ago. What is it that they said? Yogaha karmasu kaushalam. Yoga is perfection in action. And this perfection in action comes from samatvam yoga uchyate. Equanimity of mind, tranquility of mind is yoga. Without calmness of mind, you have no control over your performance. Sometimes you may be brilliant, other times you may be a dismal failure. But that's not enough. Would you go to a surgeon who once in a way comes out with a brilliant performance, at other times the patient dies? Would you go to such a surgeon? Would you go to a lawyer who sometimes wins cases for you, at other times he sleeps through his cases? No, you want perfection. And yet, every one of us is unreliable because the mind is not calm. And this unreliability, see, you may be extraordinarily talented, you may be gifted, but attitudinally fragile. Depending on your mood, depending on your attitude, your performance varies. You may be brilliant, but stubborn. You may be lethal, but terribly arrogant and egoistic. This morning I came across a situation where I made a suggestion to a person. I said, can we do this? Before I could complete the sentence, he attacked me by saying, oh, you find yourself another engineer. If I wanted to find another engineer, why would I come to you? So these are the things that are the roadblocks that stand in the way of our performance, stand in the way of a calm mind. So therefore, the analysis of what makes for a calm mind followed. They basically arrived at 3 kinds of actions that you perform, that you can perform. Number 1, niyatam karma. Niyatam karma means obligatory duty. This is the highest caliber of action that anybody can perform. Next, kamya karma, desire-driven action, where the desire to do something, to acquire something is so strong that it takes away from your obligatory duty. And then the desire mounts to such an extent that it cannot be fulfilled by ethical, moral means, and you cross the line to what is known as nishiddha karma. Nishiddha karma, prohibited action. Prohibited by what? By whom? By whom? No Shastra. Your own conscience. Prohibited by your own conscience. So these are the 3 kinds of activities that we can perform. As long as you restrict yourself to niyatam karma, obligatory duties, your mind will be calm, your intellect will be focused, your actions will be perfect. The moment you stray away from obligatory duties and go into the area of desire-driven activity, you lose your calmness of mind, you lose the tranquility of your mind. And this can happen in an instant. Therefore it is that a sports person who is performing brilliantly, suddenly you find the character of his play changes and he's out. This happens to all of us. The moment you stray away from niyatam karma, you've had it. Nishiddha karma that is suicidal. And what you need to understand is that all of us are performing nishiddha karma. All of us are focusing on desire-driven activities. Very few of us are focusing on obligations. What is my obligation? Nobody thinks of. So all you have to do is focus on this niyatam karma, you'll be fine. How many of us lead our lives based on obligations? And therefore it is, since we tend to get, you see what happens is, the desires, when you fulfill a desire, you get pleasure instantly. So this instant gratification lures us away from the path of obligatory duty, because when you perform your obligation in the beginning, it need not be pleasurable. And since all of us are driven by profit and pleasure, you tend to neglect your obligations. But in the end, it's the performance of obligation. That's why in the 3rd chapter he says, Niyatam kuru karmatvam. Exhorts Arjuna and all of us, just perform your obligation. That's all you need to do. Now, because we are tempted by selfishness, they had, the ancient sages had got certain rituals in place, and these rituals were so powerful that they reminded generation after generation of Indians to focus on niyatam karma. And this was one of the rituals, was yajna, which incidentally is performed till this day. The ritual is performed, the significance is lost. So what we need to do is revive the significance, and then you may or may not perform the ritual. This is what Krishna did at that time, the time of the Mahabharata. He totally internalized this ritual in chapter 4, where you can perform yajna every minute of your life. What is this yajna? Yajna literally means sacrifice. Because what happens is, it is selfishness that disturbs the mind. It is desire that disturbs the mind. And so they came up with this ritual called yajna. When you perform a yajna, basically it's fire sacrifice. It's a fire ritual. Anything that you do, you start a new office, you get married, you have a child, whatever happens in our life, you have a havan, right? Yajna. And this is meant to remind us of the fact that you have to stay away from desire-driven activities and move to unselfish, selfless activity. So the yajna, the havan kund, this brick wall trough represents the field of activity that you are engaged in, and every participant, all the, let's say an organization, all the employees of the organization come in every morning and they offer their talent, their ability into the kund. And that offering of the talent is called ahuti, is the offering, which you pour into the fire. And this ahuti is usually ghee or grain. When you offer ghee or grain into fire, what happens? The fire gets kindled. The fire shoots up. And when the fire shoots up, the belief is that fire god has been propitiated and is blessing all the participants. This is the ritual. But Krishna in his wisdom internalized this ritual, and when he told Arjuna to perform yajna, he did not mean start a fire outside. He meant start the fire of unselfishness within. Kindle the light of knowledge within. Fire is a great purifier. It takes care of any impurity. Similarly, unselfish activity, sacrificial activity takes care of the most deeply embedded vasanas and desires in your system and purifies you completely. So, when you offer your talent into the kund or the field of activity that you're engaged in, then what happens is the organization does well, whether it's a commercial organization or a hospital or a college or a school or whatever it be. And when that unit, that entity does well, you and I, all the participants of the organization do well, every shareholder, every stakeholder does well, society does well. Then Krishna says, the world is bound by non-yajna activities, non-sacrificial activities. If you perform selfish action, if you're driven by just concern for yourself and personal profit, then you also don't do well, the organization doesn't do well, nobody does well. So the question is, now the whole thing is converted into a ritual because any activity that you do must be punctuated by a worshipful attitude. That is why there is a combination of intellectual focus and mental surrender, a worshipful attitude towards whatever it is that you're doing. Those of you who are watching the cricket match this afternoon would have noticed one of the younger cricketers, as he was walking out of the field, he did a namaskar to the field. A musician, before he starts his performance, does namaskar to the equipment, the musical instrument. And this signifies, we're not talking about the actual namaskar, please, that you may do, may not do. But we're talking about the attitude. You must have an attitude of surrender towards the field of activity, as against having an egoistic concept that I am, as they call it, kartrutva bhavana and bhoktrutva bhavana. I am the doer, I am the enjoyer. Instead of that, you surrender to a higher ideal. So this yajna is very important. Why is it important? Because a higher ideal, see, the crux of this yajna is the fixation of a higher ideal, which only a human being has the capacity to do. Therefore it is that even in the 3rd chapter he says, Saha yajna praja sruštva purovacha prajapatihi anena prasavishyadhvam eshavostvishta kamadhuk. When the creator Prajapati created the human being, he created the human being sahayajna, along with the capacity to sacrifice, which is denied to all other creatures. So it is a privilege that you are able to sacrifice. No other creature has this privilege. Therefore, use it. This is a gift that you were born with. And he says, with this may you prosper. What does it mean? It means if you don't sacrifice, it is impossible to prosper. And therefore it is that all of us, we have success in fits and starts, bursts. The rest of the time we don't achieve success because we are not working in a spirit of sacrifice, yajna. With this may you prosper. Let this be the Kamadhenu of all your desires. Kamadhenu is the mythical cow in heaven belonging to the sage Vasishtha. And this cow, Kamadhenu, has the unique ability of granting the wishes of anybody who approaches Kamadhenu. Right? Now you will sit there and say, why don't you cut short your series of lectures and just give us the address of Kamadhenu? You will save us the trouble of coming here three more evenings, is it? Yeah. And you will save yourself the trouble of unnecessarily blowing your lungs out. But the problem is, if I knew Kamadhenu's address, I'd be the first one there. What he means is, when you function in a spirit of sacrifice for a higher ideal, your lower desires automatically get fulfilled. See, one of two things happens. Either the desire gets fulfilled or the desire gets sublimated. In other words, you rise to such an extent, you're so focused on the higher ideal that the lower loses its charm. It no longer has a grip over you. So you really don't care whether you get that or not. One way or the other, your desire gets rooted out of your system. That's the main thing. Because how did we start? We said a calm mind makes for excellent action. And how do you get rid of agitations of the mind? By dedicating your actions to a higher ideal. Unless you have a higher ideal, your mind will never be calm. And the more you get obsessed with yourself, the more agitated you will be, and these agitations will spill over from the waking state to the dream and deep sleep state also. So such a person will get nightmares, such a person will not be able to sleep. So your whole life gets ruined because of these mental agitations. And all you have to do is just shift your thinking. And that shift in thinking can happen this moment, right now. You don't have to wait. There is no gestation period at all. Right this moment, you shift your thinking and you snap out of your selfishness and you're a completely different person. Let's hope this happens to every one of us, so that On Saturday evening at 8 o'clock, we walk out totally transformed. It may not happen. This complete transformation may not happen. But a little bit, just a little shift in the thinking, that's enough to keep you going. So, the higher ideal, what does it do? The moment you fix a higher ideal, it unlocks a great deal of potential within you. You come to realize that there is a whole lot of energy, resources within you that were left untapped, unknown, unimagined. So all this energy gets released, and the most important thing is it gives you peace of mind. And thereafter, the result doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether the result of your endeavor is success or not. You remember yesterday I spoke of this movie Iqbal. This village boy, Iqbal, had a dream of being included in the Indian cricket team. And he worked so hard for it that right at the end, those of you who haven't seen it, I don't want to divulge everything. Right at the end, when he is told that, look, whatever you do in your lifetime, you will never get into the Indian cricket team. He says, it's okay, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter because I have achieved my objective anyway. So in other words, he's transcended the Indian cricket team. He's achieved his objective. This is what happens to all of us. The result doesn't matter. Doesn't matter whether people speak ill of you or speak well of you. Within yourself, you are at peace. And this is the state that every one of us should strive for, because then success is entirely under your control. As long as you're dependent on the fruit of the action, which comes from outside, which is dependent on other people, you'll always be a slave. It'll always be possible that you don't achieve it. But as long as you take it unto yourself, you're independent, you're free, you're liberated. So this spirit of yajna, when you function in, nature conspires to serve you. It is incredible what things happen to you. Yesterday, this is a true incident. Sometimes I cook up stories, but this one is a true one. Yesterday, first thing in the morning, I had to take someone to a hospital for some investigations. And as the patient went inside, and as I was waiting outside, the receptionist told me a story that was incredible. She said, just the previous evening, she had paid the first installment for an apartment that she wanted to buy. And the bank from whom she had applied for the loan, the bank manager ditched her and didn't give her the check in time. The builder gave her an ultimatum. He said, you pay by this evening or else the apartment is gone. And after work she was walking home, obviously distressed, obviously in great pain and agitated, when she met an acquaintance of hers whom she hadn't met for 15 years. She met the gentleman after 15 years, out of the blue. And he came up to her and said, what's the matter? You look very stressed. So she says, yeah, I have a problem. And he says, what's the problem? She didn't even want to tell him because she didn't think it was possible for him to help her out. Because what she wanted was 7 lakhs that she had to pay the builder. So, but because he asked her, she almost in a fatalistic manner said, she narrated the whole incident and said, I need 7 lakhs. You know what the guy said? You'll get that check by 7:30 in the evening. She said, from whom? He said, I'll send it to you. You know what the story was? 15 years ago when she last met him, he was in dire straits and she had loaned him 2,000 rupees. Just 2,000 rupees, 15 years ago. And that man hadn't paid back the 2,000 rupees to her till date. For 15 years he hadn't paid her. And he told her, says, you have no idea how what a terrible condition I was in 15 years ago when you loaned me that 2,000 rupees, when you gave me the 2,000 rupees. And I used that 2,000 rupees. With that, I have now become a millionaire. So he gave her back 7 lakhs. And the long and short of this whole story is, this lady, the next morning when I happened to be there, she couldn't get over it. How is it that 2,000 rupees has converted into 7 lakhs? What an investment. Wouldn't you like to make an investment like that? But the problem is, when she gave him that 2,000 rupees, she had no idea that it would come back to her, and at the right time and the right place. If he had given the money to her 1 year back, she might have squandered it and she might have done something else with it. But she got it exactly when she needed it. This is what it does to you. You meet with serendipitous experiences. You come across sudden, unexpected, totally unimagined, happy, successful experiences in life. But for which you have to first invest. How do you invest? Perform yajna activities, says Krishna. This spirit of yajna pervades the entire universe. Every single element in nature functions in a spirit of yajna. The sun gives light and heat. Have you ever heard of the sun giving solar bill to us? There are companies that tap solar energy and bill you. But the sun never bills. The flowers give fragrance. No flower in the world ever registers it in the patent office. Have you ever heard of a flower saying, my fragrance must be patented and anybody who wants the fragrance must pay me? No. The perfume industry extracts the fragrance from the flower and then patents it. But the flower gives of itself freely. So also the river waters, the clouds give rain. Every single element in the universe seems to function in a spirit of yajna except the human being. And therefore it is that no other element in nature is stressed, no other element needs, Prozac, no other element needs a psychiatrist except the human being. And it is the human being that imagines that cats and dogs have stress and they give Prozac to the cats and dogs. This is the height of madness. You haven't heard of it? Because what happens is, when you are in stress, you believe the whole world is in stress. So you want to treat others for the stress. The result of all this is 3 things happen to you. You gain enormous success way beyond your imagination. You find happiness in the here and now. You find fulfillment in the very action without depending on the fruit of action. And most importantly, you develop spiritually. As you fix your sights on a higher and higher ideal, all your thoughts, your energies are focused on that. The lower desires get starved, lose their hold on you, drop off. This is how you evolve spiritually. So, why we're talking about this is because every one of us is looking for this combination of success, happiness, and spiritual growth. And Krishna says, if you don't perform yajna, na siddhim, na sukham, na param gatim. You will not get siddhi, success, you won't get sukham, happiness, nor will you evolve to the highest state of perfection. Now coming back to chapter 7, we'll move on to verse 7. There is nothing beyond me, O Dhananjaya, winner of wealth. All this is strung on me like rows of pearls on a string. So, as we saw yesterday, this entire chapter, the first 6 verses deal with the 2 aspects of me. Now with the 7th verse, we enter the second topic, expressions of Brahman. How does this Brahman, which is unmanifest, express itself in the world? 7 to 11. And he starts off by saying, there is nothing beyond me, there is nothing higher than me. Matta parataram nanya. This is the highest. When he says nothing higher than me, you remember yesterday we spoke of 3 things. Kshara, perishable world. Akshara, imperishable aspect of the perishable world. And Uttama Purusha. To refresh your memory, let's take an example. Suppose a city kid in Bombay says, oh, I've never seen mud. Where do you get mud? Where do you see clay? So you look at an earthenware pot and you say, yeah, this is clay. And then the kid says, it misunderstands and feels that clay is of that particular shape, size, color, etc. So you understand that the child has misunderstood the whole thing and say, no, it is not this particular name and form, it's not this shape and size and color. It is the material with which this pot is made. So what do? You crush that earthenware pot and take the powder and say, look, this is clay. So what are you doing? First you show the perishable aspect, kshara, which is the clay pot. Then because the child has misunderstood and has seen it as a perishable thing, you break it, powder it and show the clay and say, look, this clay with which the perishable pot has been made is clay, the imperishable aspect of the perishable clay pot. You understand? Akshara. But then, one day you take the child on a weekend to Matheran, and there, when he speaks of mud, where the whole of Matheran is full of mud, the child thinks of the earthenware pot in Bombay and says, oh, clay, mud is there. To which you say, no, that clay is not restricted to the powder which came out of the mud pot. Mud exists way beyond that mud pot, it's all pervading, it's everywhere in the world. Uttama Purusha. Right? So if you only show the clay pot, he thinks it's perishable. Then you powder it and show the powder, his concept of mud is still restricted to the clay pot. So you have to smash that concept and say, no, it's beyond, way beyond that. Similarly, when you and I ask, so where is God? God is here everywhere in the world, in the universe. So then we misunderstand and think God is perishable, because everything in the world is perishable. So he says, no, this is not, this is kshara, perishable. There is the substratum, the imperishable aspect of the perishable universe, which is God. Akshara. Even then you haven't got it, because your concept of God becomes finite, restricted, limited to the universe. So he smashes that concept also and he says, no, I exist beyond the universe, Uttama Purusha. Then you don't understand anything. But I mean it, because God is beyond intellectual conception. That's when you begin to understand. That's why in the Kenopanishad he comes up, I know it, I don't know it. Not that I know it, I know it. So he speaks in terms of contradictions because it's beyond intellectual conception. Anyway, coming back. So here he's saying, When he says there is nothing beyond me, he's referring to me means what? Uttama Purusha. That Brahman, unmanifest Brahman which exists beyond the universe. Because the universe and the substratum of the universe is only a minuscule, infinitesimal disturbance in the entire mass of Brahman which is infinite. So naturally there's nothing higher than me, O Dhananjaya. All this is strung on me like rows of pearls on a string. Sarvamidam. See, it's like this. When you go to a puppet show and you see the puppets are kshara, perishable. Lower prakriti, as he said, we saw yesterday. Then you go to a puppet show, there's a little child there. The child is completely carried away by the puppet show. And she thinks that is real. That little girl has an older brother who's about 12, 13. That older brother, he thinks he's very wise because he tells the little sister, what are you getting so carried away by it? You see the strings there? That's what makes the puppets move. So he's sitting there, alipta, detached, because he understands that it's the strings that operate. That strings are higher prakriti, akshara. And you, the adult, knows that there is a man sitting there with the fingers, and the puppeteer is the real person who drives this whole show. Similarly, you and I see the world. We are like that little girl, children. We get carried away by the world. Among us, there is one stray, wise person who understands that there is something beyond the world. And this is what he's coaxing us, he's goading us towards, to see the strings. And look beyond that and you see the puppeteer. And what an experience that must be. What a wonderful experience, because then and only then do you get completely free of what the world has to offer. Because let's face it, when you are operating in the world, how do you operate? You see, hear, taste, smell, touch. Every one of these is subject to the pairs of opposites. It may be pleasant, it may be unpleasant. You may hear nice things, you may hear vicious things. You may see pleasant sights, you may see unpleasant sights. So you are buffeted by these pairs of opposites as long as your attention is on the object of experience. So what he's trying to do is, he's trying to get us to see the root of the experience, trace it back. And how do you trace it back? Irrespective of what it is that you see, hear, smell, taste, touch. What is it that enables me to do all these things? Is one. Right? So what happens is, in our experience, we experience a diversity, a divergence. Because seeing is not hearing, hearing is not tasting, tasting is not smelling, smelling is not touching. They're all diverse experiences. Yet when you trace it back to their very source, there's only one. There is that one spirit, one Atman that enables me to see, hear, taste, smell, touch. Then you move to emotions. I feel joy, I feel sorrow, anger, jealousy, hatred, love, so on and so forth. These are all various emotions, different emotions. But you trace those emotions back. What is it in me that enables me to feel these emotions? Is one. Then move to the intellect. Thoughts can be confused, you can have clarity of thinking, you can have brilliant thinking, you can have dull thinking. But all these are supported by, facilitated by that one power, Atman. This is true convergence. Modern technology speaks of convergence, right? They don't know what convergence is. It's the Bhagavad Gita that talks about true convergence. Whatever happens in your life, you trace it back and you find there is one entity. And that one entity is unaffected by what happens around us. And once you get there, you break free from the limitations of the body, mind and intellect. This is the significance behind the birth of Krishna. Krishna was born in a prison, but the moment he was born, they say, the prison gates flung open. It meant Krishna was an Avatara Purusha, means realized at birth. So even though he was born within the confines of the body, mind and intellect, the moment he was born, he gained freedom from the body, mind and intellect. That body, mind and intellect which crushes us, imprisons us, had no effect on him whatsoever. This is something that we need to work towards. And you can work towards it only when you have exposure to this knowledge. That exposure must be every day. We clean everything about us. We clean our homes, we clean our cars, we clean our bodies, we bathe, all kinds of things we clean, except our minds. And this spring cleaning of the mind needs to take place every single day. So, as you gain this exposure, you develop that, as they call it, the opening of the third eye. Means you see the same things. You see the superficial things. You see the diversity. But instantly you go back to that unity that keeps the whole thing going. Then and only then do you gain this peace of mind. So, there is nothing beyond me, O Dhananjaya. Dhananjaya, he says, because all of us are expert at gaining the wealth outside of ourselves. Isn't it so? Morning to night, particularly in this city, the commercial capital of India, everything is around money. Whether it's a stockbroker or a real estate agent or an executive or whatever it is, we're very good at accessing the wealth of the world. But in calling us Dhananjaya, the suggestion is, why don't you look within and access this infinite storehouse of wealth within? Next verse, please. 8.
Rasohamapsu kaunteya prabhasmi shashi suryayoho pranavah sarva vedeshu shabdah khe paurusham nrushu.
I am the taste in water, O Kaunteya. I am the brilliance in the moon and sun. I am Pranava, the syllable Om, in all the Vedas. I am sound in space and valor among human beings. O Kaunteya, he says, son of Kunti, in a very affectionate way, because Krishna and Arjuna were dear friends, they were like brothers. And where there is an atmosphere of love and affection, the knowledge goes through faster. So, I am the rasa in water. Rasa means taste, flavor, relish. But it also means aesthetic delight, spiritual delight. So what he's saying here is, water is in fact a tasteless liquid, as you know. Water per se, pure water, is tasteless. Yet, without water, there is no taste in anything. If you were to take a desiccated powder, dehydrated stuff, and try and taste it, there's no taste in it. So, water by itself is tasteless, and yet water lends taste to everything. That's why he says, I am the rasa. And so is it in our lives. Whatever you experience, you can earn a great deal of money, you can have the most wonderful family, you can do whatever you like in the world. But minus spiritual knowledge, minus this base of the spirit, minus this contact with Atman in whatever way, even in the slightest way, all your experiences become insipid. It is so true. You go back to your own experience, you look around at people, and you find the truth of the matter is, it is Atman, it is this spiritual alignment that lends flavor, that lends delight and enjoyment to your life. Minus this, there is no enjoyment. You will have everything. You will have all the wealth in the world, you will have a following, you will have family, you will have this, that and the other, but the rasa, the enjoyment will not be there. On the other hand, you find a person who aligns with Atman. He may not have anything in the world, but he'll be in bliss. This is what the scriptures are trying to tell us. Now this doesn't mean, see, we completely misunderstood this and thought that the Bhagavad Gita is trying to get us to part with our wealth and the worldly contacts. No, it's not trying to. Why would it try to? It's like an adult. As an adult, why would you like to deny a child of toys? But as an adult, you will certainly be interested in the child growing to appreciate better things, more fulfilling things than mere toys. Is that not true? Now, when you as an adult try and tell a child to grow to appreciate higher things, if the child misunderstands and says, "You're taking away my toys. I don't like you. I hate you. Go away." This is exactly what we're saying. So please understand, no sage in the world will want to take away your toys from you. But every sage in the world wants you to grow, to understand and access far more enjoyable, far more fulfilling and gratifying things that you are heir to. That's what he's saying here. I am the taste in water. It is that consciousness which enables you to operate in the world, and if you are connected with that consciousness, only then can you enjoy what the world has to offer. Then he says, I am the brilliance in the moon and the sun. Sun, direct light; moon, reflected light. Whatever be the source of light, I am that light-giving principle that enables the sun to give direct light, enables the moon to give reflected light. And when he says sun and moon, it's not restricted to only sun and moon. Wherever there is light, I am the source of that light, is what he's saying. The lighting principle in all sources of light is Atman. I am Pranava, the syllable Om in all the Vedas. How beautifully he puts it. The 4 Vedas are exhaustive literature. Thousands and thousands of verses of chaste poetry, chaste literature. But the main theme, the bottom line of all the Vedas is what? Atman. And Om is the most powerful symbol of Atman. Atman, as we said earlier, is beyond the intellect, beyond the 5 elements, beyond the world. So how can you capture it? You need a symbol from the world to focus your attention on, and once you get established in that, move on to the ideal. So the idol, the subtlest idol of Atman is the syllable Om. It's called Pranava, the first syllable. Om comes from 3 alphabets: A, U, Ma. A is a guttural sound. There's no sound beyond A. U is in the middle, and Ma is the extreme beyond which there is no sound. So these 3, A, U and Ma, represent the entire sound phenomenon. Sound is possible because of silence as the background. You can't hear anything against noise. So silence is necessary for you to be able to decipher sound. So A, U and Ma represent the waking, dream and deep sleep states of consciousness. And the substratum of these 3, waking, dream and deep sleep, is the 4th plane of consciousness, the state of realization. And therefore Om is a very powerful symbol of Atman. This is the intellectual appeal. Now if you say, now you're getting complicated, I don't want to listen to all that, fine. The very sound of Om inspires people. It has a mesmerizing effect on people. Try it. Sit quietly and say, Om. However agitated you are, temporarily you feel calm. So it has an intonational effect, which appeals to your heart, and it has an intellectual meaning to it, which appeals to your head. Both put together a very, very powerful symbol of Atman. So he says, I am the Pranava syllable Om in all the Vedas. I am the sound in space, and I am valor among human beings. Paurusham means valor, courage, fortitude. All the good qualities that make for a human being is presented here, and he says, I am this. So why is he talking about the quintessence, the essence of all good experiences? Because you see diversity. These are manifestations. And you get carried away by the manifestations. So when he says this, he is nudging you to look beyond the manifestation, and there you come in contact with Atman. Verse 9.
पुण्यो गन्धः पृथिव्यां च तेजश्चास्मि विभावसौ जीवनं सर्वभूतेषु तपश्चास्मि तपस्विषु.
I am the divine fragrance in earth and the radiance in fire. I am the life in all beings, and I am penance in ascetics. In other words, he says, I am the dharma, the quintessence of everything, all experiences. Trace back any experience in your life, you reach Brahman. So therefore, he can't understand how you miss it. And we can't understand how to get it. So there's a complete communication gap between Krishna and us. So what he's saying here is, I am the sweet fragrance. The earth is the first element to be smelled. You know, when it first rains, when the monsoon breaks, the first rains that come, unfortunately in Bombay you don't experience it because there is no mud. There's no earth here. It's all paved. But where there is the sweet fragrance that comes from the earth when there is the first shower is very, very thrilling. So that's what he's referring to. It's the first element which can be smelt. And he says sweet because foul smell agitates the mind. So sweet. Then he says, I am the brilliance in fire, the radiance in fire. The dharma, the essence of fire is brilliance. Can you think of fire without brilliance? It's an essential factor of fire. Then he says, I am the life in all beings. Every living being in the world has a physical component, has a mental component, but these are dead, inert matter. There is something in every living being that lends life, and that life principle is me, is what he's saying here. Life in all beings. An interesting aspect is in the Western culture, they think of evolution of beings, right? In the Vedantic concept, it is not evolution of beings because the essence in all beings is the same, Atma. Then what changes? The structure changes. When the structure gets sophisticated, the manifestation of Brahman that already is there becomes more and more brilliant. It's like electricity in a 0 candle bulb, very dull. Electricity in a 100-watt bulb, bright. Electricity in a bulb in a cricket stadium where you have a day-night match, brilliant. What's the difference in the electricity? Electricity is the same. The difference is in the equipment through which it functions. So if the structure is weak, the manifestation is weak. If the structure is sophisticated, manifestation is brilliant. And then he says something which is very interesting. He says, I am tapaha in tapasvis. What is tapa? Tapas or penance is viewed by us as drudgery, as painful. But in a tapasvi, a person who performs penance, austerity, it's no longer drudgery, it's not a pain, it's a pleasure. Look at a tennis player, Sania Mirza. Look at a golfer, this young girl, what's her name? Michelle Y, 15-year-old girl who's come up in the field of golf. You look at any of these young cricketers, What is their life? Once, Sania Mirza was invited to a function along with me. And one of the audience asked her, what is your daily routine? What's your daily schedule? She says, you don't want to know. Because it's just tennis, tennis, and tennis. That's it. And the way she described it, she can't do what she likes, she can't watch a movie if she likes, she can't eat what she likes. Everything is geared towards tennis. And yet, and the same person asked her, don't you get bored of it? She says, no. Every day of my life is so exciting. I can't imagine life without tennis. That's what it is. So, from the outside, if you're not dedicated to your particular field of endeavor, then it seems like drudgery. But once you're dedicated to it, the pursuit of that itself, the investment of your energies, tapas, is such a pleasure that you wouldn't want to do anything else. Ask a musician who practices 16 hours a day. He finds immense pleasure in just the practice. Ask a sports person. Ask an artist. Recently in the United States, I met with a lady, a fairly elderly lady, who has done pencil sketches. It's so intricate and so delicate and huge sketches that I asked her, I said, oh, how long does it take to finish one? You know what she said? 3 months. Then I asked her, when do you do it? She says, I stay awake the whole night because it's impossible to do it during the day. There are too many distractions. So night after night, she keeps awake for 3 months to complete one sketch. To her, it's a pleasure. To us, who are not artists, it's a pain. So it's a question of how you look at it. Austerity in ascetics. Tapas is the pathway to spiritual enlightenment. In fact, tapas is the pathway, is the means to success in any field of endeavor, but particularly spiritual. What is it? Tapas is nothing but conserving the energy that would otherwise be wasted in unproductive channels and redirecting it towards a goal that you want to achieve. Plain and simple. But it is this conservation of energy that you find painful in the beginning because you want to get distracted. The mind gets distracted. You want to go to a movie, you want to go to a party, you want to go here, there and everywhere. This doesn't mean that a person who's doing tapas can't do all of this. What it means is, once you fix a goal, anything that comes in the way of your attaining the goal, you should have the intellectual power to say no to it. If it does not interfere with the attainment of the goal, by all means, enjoy it. So it's not painful really. It's just a question of having focus. It's a question of giving up your own lower desires for your own higher aspirations. So you don't feel frustrated. So what is he saying here? Brahman is the lord of senses. It is the enlivening principle that enlivens all experiences, and it is the penance in ascetics. Next verse, 10.
बीजं मां सर्वभूतानां विद्धि पार्थ सनातनं बुद्धिर्बुद्धिमतामस्मि तेजस्तेजस्विनामहम्.
Know me, O Partha, son of Prutha, as the eternal seed of all beings. I am the intelligence of the intelligent, the brilliance of the brilliant. So, in this verse, he covers the causal body, subtle body, gross body. When he says, I know me as the eternal seed of all beings, the eternal seed means a seed which causes an effect, but there is no cause-effect relationship. I'll explain. As you walk out of here, if you see a rope lying on the ground, you trip over it. But the rope is placed in such a position, it's coiled in such a way that in the dark you mistake it for a snake. Okay? Your friend who's accompanied you here and you're going out together has better eyesight than you and sees, what does your friend see? The rope. You see the snake, your friend sees the rope, your friend understands that you have misunderstood the rope as a snake. So where did the snake come from? What is the cause of the snake? Ignorance of what? Rope. So the rope is, see, what I mean is, if the rope were not there, you would not be seeing the snake, right? So in a way, the rope is the cause of the snake. But every rope doesn't cause a snake. The same rope doesn't cause a snake because your friend is seeing the rope, you're seeing a snake. So it is the eternal seed of the snake. In other words, if you look at it one way, it is the cause of the snake. If you look at it another way, it is not the cause of the snake. It is the as you rightly said, it is the ignorance of the rope that has caused the snake. Okay? So when he says eternal cause, eternal seed of all beings is the same way. There is only one Brahman. But because you don't see that one Brahman, ignorance of Brahman leads to the creation of the waking and dream states of consciousness. So all these beings have come out of Brahman, you say. But the Brahman is not the direct cause of all the beings. What is the cause of all the beings? Ignorance. Let's take another example. You're awake, and suppose you find it a little, maybe you've woken up early, maybe you've had a tiring day, and this air-conditioned comfort here is all very conducive for taking a little nap. So when you doze, you dream. And you enter a dream world, and that dream world is completely different from where you're sitting here. You dream that there's a tiger chasing you. Where is a tiger here? There's no tiger. So when you enter the dream, you've created the dream and the dreamer, the dream objects, the dream world, all these have come from what? The waker's mind. The waker's mind is the eternal seed of all dreams. The waker's mind itself hasn't caused the dreams, it's the ignorance of the waking state that has caused the dream state. Okay? So in the same way, he says, it is the eternal seed. I am the eternal seed of all beings. I am the intelligence of the intelligence. So when he says seed, seed refers to vasanas, therefore he is referring to the causal body. The vasanas means unmanifest desires. Then he says intelligence of the intelligent, referring to the mind and intellect, the subtle body. When he says intelligence, he is not talking about IQ. He says he's not talking about intelligence as against a dull person. He's talking about that principle in every being that makes it conscious, aware of whatever it is that it knows. So including a worm that is crawling on the ground is aware of certain things. A caterpillar is aware of certain things. A bird that flies in the air is aware of certain things. And so are you and I aware of certain things. So that which enables your mind to feel various emotions, that which enables the intellect to think various thoughts is me, is what he's saying here. So subtle body covered. And then he says, I am the splendor in the splendid. I am the brilliance in among the brilliant, referring to the gross body. Now what happens is, as you develop spiritually, as you purify your mind of hatred and negative emotions, as your intellect becomes sharp and clear, you develop a certain aura. That is what he's referring to. Tejas. Tejas is translated as spiritual luster, brilliance, sharpness, splendor, prowess. strength of character, a magical power that you get. Magical doesn't mean you perform miracles, please. It's a, I don't know how to explain it. It's a purity of mind. Purity of the inner personality expresses itself as brilliant Tejas. So he says, I am the Tejas among all the Tejasvis, among the brilliant. So there is this striking quality that a spiritually evolved person develops. And this is the true beauty in a person. Beauty is also the wrong word. Because you see, if to the extent you don't have this spiritual luster which comes out of unselfishness, which comes out of spiritual development, to that extent you need to make up for it by external aids, beauty aids. So how do you figure it out? The more number of times you need to go to a beauty parlor, the less spiritual luster you have. Right? Because if you have the spiritual luster, there is no need to go to a beauty parlor. We are not saying you should not go, so don't look at me like that. You can go as many times as you like, but understand it's the lack of spiritual luster that creates the need for a beauty parlor. So, verse 11.
Balam balavatam कामराग विवर्जितम् धर्मा विरुद्धो भूतेषु कामोऽस्मि भरतर्षभ.
I am the strength of the strong, free from passion and attachment. In beings, I am desire, not opposed to dharma. Dharma, order of the Vedas. O Bharatarshava, bull among the Bharatas. What a beautiful verse this is. He says, I am the strength of the strong, devoid of kama and raga, free from kama and raga. See, he's not talking of the strength of a sumo wrestler. He's talking about the strength of character. Who is a person who's strong in character? A person who is free from kama, desire, raga, attachment. This internal strength is inversely proportionate to selfishness. To the extent you're selfish, you become weak. To the extent you're attached, you become weak. To the extent you have desires, you become weak. Because then you're dependent on the world. So, drop the kama, drop the raga, and automatically you become strong. So what is kama? Kama is desire for a future acquisition. So that is intangible, invisible. Raga is attachment which comes from the past. Whenever you think constantly of a particular object or being, and mind you, this is so insidious, before you know it, you get attached. And you think you can handle it. This is what is conveyed to us by the story of this mighty elephant, Gajendra. Gajendra was a devotee of the Lord Vishnu. And every day he would go to the river and pluck a lotus from the lake to offer to Lord Vishnu. And he got so complacent. You see, this is what happens to all of us. When once you're on the spiritual path, you think, oh, I can handle everything. I can handle attachment. I can handle desire. I can handle things. So you get complacent. And Gajendra, same thing happened to him. So one day when he went to pluck a lotus to offer to the Lord, the crocodile got him. And Gajendra thought, oh, I am the mighty Gajendra, I can handle it. I can shake it off. So he ignored the crocodile. And before you knew it, the crocodile had him. At that time, what saved him was his unselfishness. His only thought was, what a pity, today I cannot offer the lotus to the Lord. He didn't think, oh, what will happen to me, I'm dying, I'm suffering. No, not a thought of himself. And it is this complete, total selflessness that saved him, because then the story goes, Vishnu sent his chakra to take care of the crocodile and Gajendra was saved. Now Gajendra at least had some spiritual wealth to fall back on. You and I, without having that spiritual wealth, have the audacity to feel that, oh, I can take care of the world. I can take care of addictions. I can take care of attachments. No, these attachments and desires, before you know it, they get to you. And then you're lost. Because neither do you have the selflessness of Gajendra, nor do you have the power to take care of the world. So therefore, be careful, is what he's saying here. I am the strength among the strong, free from passion, desire and attachment. Desire and attachment drain you of energy, it makes you weak. Think back, one desire that enters your system, it could be for the most trivial things, it can give you sleepless nights. One little attachment in your system can wreak havoc. You have to go back and look at your own life and see what's happening. What's happening in your life? What has happened from the time that you were a kid up to now? And then watch out for it. That's all that he's saying here. Watch out for it means get your intellect in place, sharpen your intellect, strengthen your intellect, be on guard, understand the power of the world. It's quite formidable. And to overcome this formidable power of the world, you need an equally powerful intellect. And you need unselfishness. Anybody who's unselfish can freely move about in the world without danger of getting hit by either desire or attachment. Once you overcome kama and raga by tapas, then what happens? You develop this desire that is not contrary to the Vedas. Desire for realization is not opposed to the Vedas. You see, in the Indian system, there is complete, total shraddha in the injunction of the Vedas. So anything that is opposed to the Vedas is considered not right. So here he says, I am desire not opposed to the Vedas. Desire for realization is not taboo. Desire for spiritual development is not taboo. Because earlier he says, drop the kama desire, drop the attachment. So you'll walk out and say, he said, drop desire, drop attachment. First desire you're going to drop is drop desire for Bhagavad Gita. So tomorrow you won't come. So Krishna has understood that. So therefore he says, no. Desire for realization, desire for spiritual evolution is not contrary to the Vedas. And that desire, I am. So, not opposed to dharma. And then he addresses Arjuna as, oh Bharatarshava, the fabulously inspiring address. Bharatarshava means bull among the Bharatas. Bharatas, Indians. The word Bharata itself is inspiring. Bharata comes from two words. Bha means light. That's why you refer to the sun as Bhaskara, that which gives light. Rataha means to revel in, rejoice in. You and I are Indians because we are designed to rejoice not in the mall culture but in the light of Atman. Only then are you an Indian. How nice it would be if the Indian government were to take the stand that Indian passport will be given only to those who rejoice in Atman. Instantly our population problem will get taken care of. So, oh Bharata, you, not only are you an Indian who have the capacity to rejoice, revel in the light of Atman, but you are Bharatarshava, you are the bull among the Bharatas. Bull doesn't mean literally bull, please. The bull and the cow seem to live on the principle of just giving, on niyatam karma. You remember we started with that, on obligations. No bull or cow demands rights. It just does its duties. And this is what we need to inculcate in our system. The Indian tradition has survived so many centuries because every Indian citizen functioned on this concept of niyatam karma, just do your duty. Any family, any society, any organization where every member focuses on performance of duties and not claiming rights, there is harmony, there is prosperity, there is success. The moment you start claiming rights, this is mine, what happens? There's bitter quarreling and battles. You're seeing this happen. You're seeing this happen in families, you're seeing it happen in organizations, you're seeing nationally too, of course. So, therefore, he says, Bharatarshava, you're a bull among the Bharatas, you're the finest specimen of humanity as an Indian. And among Indians, you are the privileged class. Who is he talking to? Us, all of us. And in this highly inspired mood, he moves now to verse 12.
ये चैव सात्विका भावाः राजसास्तामसाश्च ये मत्त एवेति तान् विद्धि न त्वहं तेषु ते मयि.
Know that the states of sattva, purity, rajas, activity, and tamas, indolence, emanate from me alone. I am not in them, but they are in me. In this verse, he speaks of the three states of sattva, rajas, and tamas. Tamas is the state of avarana. Avarana means shrouding, ignorance. And as a result of this ignorance, the shrouding of Atman completely, your real potential, what happens is you find pleasure in sloth, in indifference, in laziness, in inertia, procrastination. This is the lowest quality of a human being, tamas. This is total ignorance. Then comes the second stage, which is rajas, partial ignorance. When you've overcome the avarana, the shrouding, partially, there's partial knowledge. Partial knowledge leads to agitations. Vikshepa is agitations. So in the state of avarana, the desires are completely, totally shrouded in the unmanifest state. And you are in a vegetable kind of existence. In rajas, vikshepa, the desires are manifest, and therefore you are in a state of mental agitation. This is an animalistic state. Both these, the tamasic person and the rajasic person, are in ignorance and both chase the world. The rajasic person actively chases the world. The tamasic person waits for the world to come to him to enjoy. The wise is the sattvic person, where he has reached the state of awakening of something beyond the world. He's serene, he's tranquil, he's calm, he's independent of the world. And therefore he's independent because he has transcended the desire. This is the human state. So in the next few verses, he speaks of these two, tamas and rajas, and how because of their ignorance they chase the world. And next he says, all these emanate from me. Sattva, rajas and tamas, all these three gunas or states emanate from Atman, from Brahman. I am not in them, but they are in me. It's like when you go out and see the ocean and the waves in the ocean. The waves are in the ocean, but the ocean is not in the waves, in the individual waves. I am not imprisoned by the manifestation. Sattva, rajas, tamas are manifestations. So having said this, he embarks on the third topic, which we'll continue tomorrow.